Good morning and welcome to our class on special servants this quarter. We've talked about so far evangelists and we've talked about elders one time. We'll continue that discussion on elders this morning. But before we do that, I want to do a little bit of review back all the way back to our very first class. So get your remembering caps on. You may turn your notes back to those pages if you want. But I want us to kind of review again, what's the purpose of special servants? In Ephesians 4, Paul tells us what they're to achieve, why, and what that will accomplish for the kingdom. And what are those things? All right, so the building up of the body. And how does that happen? How do special servants aid in that building up? All right, so they're to be equippers. So there are all these special servants mentioned at the beginning of Ephesians 4. You have elders, evangelists, preachers, teachers, prophets, and apostles. I may have missed one. All of these in order to equip the saints for what? Maturity and good works is specifically called out. So the goal is to create mature, stable Christians that are growing as images of Christ. And if that happens, how will that be evident in those Christians' lives and in their walks with God? What'd you say? They'll grow. Great. How will they grow? Belinda?
Unity, knowledge.
Yeah, so they'll grow into the unity and the knowledge of faith. There's a couple other ways that especially the body is described as those individual Christians grow and the body improves. What will happen to the body of Christ or to the church? It builds itself up in love. Great. And what will that accomplish? How will that show up? Julie?
Unity, each part
Works properly. Yeah, that's in the ESV, that's what Paul says, is that each member or the group will grow together, working properly, built up in love. And so if we think about that as like a 3-step situation, all right? So we have special servants. The first thing they're to do is to equip in order that the Christians, that the individual people that they're working with are mature, they're stable. That looks like they're not tossed about by doctrine, is what he says. They're no longer tossed to and fro by doctrines. And then the body is going to have some impacts. So I think one of the things I want to stress this morning is that special servants, as we talk about them, they impact the body as a whole, but in many ways their work is with individual Christians. They work with the corporate group, all of us together, but in many ways they achieve the majority of their work through the way they affect the lives, the work, the service of individual members, and then the body benefits from that. We can't expect elders especially, but I would also say evangelists, to simply impact the group as a whole. They have to impact the lives of the people that they're working with. And so as we've done many times, when we think about, well, then what lens or what things would we look for in those people that are filling those roles as special servants? if they're supposed to do both of these things, they're supposed to impact the group as a whole, but the majority of that is achieved by working with individuals. How would that inform the men we look for to fill roles as special servants? How would that inform the men that we're looking for? If they're supposed to achieve both, they're supposed to impact the entire group. When I say corporate group, I just mean a group of people. But a lot of this is about how they help to grow and build individual Christians. How does that inform the people we look for to fill these roles? Crystal?
Relationships with people and be involved in people's lives.
Right. They have to have relationships with people. They can't impact the lives of the people until they actually know them. Michael?
Maybe it's able to teach in a different light.
Oh.
It's just like, yeah, I can do Bible class really well, but individually teach someone to be able to.
Yeah, so it gives some more color to that concept of able to teach. I love that. And part of the reason why I like Michael bringing that out is, as we talked a little bit last week, sometimes we look at these passages like 1 Timothy 3, Titus 1, maybe 1 Peter 5, and we generate kind of a list of qualifications, and we kind of check those off, and they don't have as much, call it depth or fidelity, because we aren't approaching it from the work and what they're supposed to accomplish. So that informs us a little bit more that there are multiple ways that we would look for an elder, in this case, to be able to teach. They'd want to be able to teach, at some level, the entire group. But they also need to be able to teach individuals in a one-on-one setting. What else would we look for? By example. And so when we look at 1 Peter 5 this morning, that's going to be one of the things that's called out, is Paul tells us a lot about, or Peter tells us a lot about how these men are actually to do their work. It's interesting. He says almost very little about the work, but spends more time on the how than the what, which I think is really great, because we have quite a few passages that talk about the what, but Peter gives us more of the how. And one of those, to Wayne's point, is he's going to say, not domineering, but by example. And so if we're looking for a man that's not domineering and he leads by example, we're looking for someone different than someone who issues edicts, that focuses on power instead of example. Great. Anything else on that before we go on? Okay. Last week we talked a little bit about Acts 20. Do you guys remember, what did Paul charge those elders at Ephesus with, and why? What was he extremely concerned about? If you're looking in your notes, this should be lesson 4, I believe. Yeah, he's worried about wolves among them, and in a couple different ways, right? So he gives them a couple warnings about where wolves will come from. What are those? Yeah, he actually says within you, that there's risk that you yourselves will become wolves. And so he encourages them to inspect themselves, but also each other, I would say, when he talks about yourselves. And then where else are wolves going to come from? Outside. They're going to come from outside in, wearing sheep's clothing, and then they will seek to devour the brethren. And so he tells them to do a few things. What are those? Admonish everyone, including themselves, and he uses his own example that he spent years with them admonishing with tears. How are they going to know that these issues are arising?
They have to pay attention to themselves and the flock.
Yeah, they're going to have to pay attention to themselves and the flock. This is seen in terms in Acts 20 like Be careful. Pay careful attention. Be alert. And then uses those examples of himself as admonishing. Last week, we did not talk about one part of Acts 20 that I do want to make sure we reference. If you'll look at verse 33 in Acts 20, we did not speak about this issue. What does verse 33 of Acts 20 talk to us about? Or those men, I should say. You could read even more. You could look at 33, 34, 35. He gives a specific warning and admonition. What should they be worried about? I coveted no one's silver or gold or apparel. You yourselves know that these hands ministered to my necessities and to those who were with me. In all things I have shown you that by working hard in this way, we must help the weak and remember the words of the Lord Jesus, how he himself said, it is more blessed to give than to receive. Barry?
Peter tells us that one of the key symptoms or objects of a false teacher is
Money. You're going to see this in different passages as shameful gain. It comes up in Titus, comes up in 1 Peter. Shameful gain. He says he coveted no one's gold, apparel, or silver. I think there's a monetary aspect here that they need to be concerned about. They need to make certain that they or others like them are not exploiting the congregation for financial purposes. I think there's another way to think about this, though, as well. And that someone who is modeling what Paul talks about here as having hands that minister to his necessities and to the necessities of those around him. And then he says that we must help the weak and remember it's more blessed to give than to receive. That describes a man that to me isn't just indicative of financial things. When we're looking for a servant to help lead us and care for us, we're looking for a man who's going to give us his life. That his dedication to the brethren, to the church, to the Lord, is not to lift himself up. It's not to have power. It's not to just tell people what to do. Instead, it's a sacrificial point of view that looks at how his service can equip the saints, create stability, help grow the congregation in love, and to work properly. It's not just about money. And I think we need to consider and talk about the shameful gain issue potentially. But we have exposure to lots of men who aren't, we don't have a tradition of paying our elders generally, even though we're told that we can. So I think sometimes we look at, well, they're not in it for shameful gain because we're not paying them. This concept is speaking about a point of view of how they approach interactions with other people. Are they seeking to get from other people when they serve them? Or are they seeking to give? Because if they're not seeking to give when they serve, their goal is not servantship. It is something different than that. Be it power or authority or praise or whatever. If they're not dedicated to being the giver, then that means that they are taking. And it's about more than just money. Let's go on and do a little bit of review in Titus 1. We talked about that there's really, call it 4 things that Paul highlighted as work. to do for these elders. This will be in lesson 5 if you're looking in your notes. Do you remember any of the 4 things that Paul highlighted as work for these elders to do? Julie?
Give instruction in sound doctrine.
All right, give instruction in sound doctrine. That's number 2 on my list. What else? What'd you say? Hospitable. So I don't have that listed on my list. I'm not saying that you shouldn't. As a work, I have it listed as a quality or character trait. So I'm not criticizing. I'm just telling you why that one doesn't show up on my list in that way. I would call that a quality or character trait that you could write down in that matrix, that table you have, as either one of those things, right? What else? We talked about 2 specific skills. One of them is instruction, and what's the other one? Similar but different.
Being able to silence false teachers.
Yeah, to be able to rebuke. Yep. So they're going to rebuke those who contradict sound doctrine. The first work that I have listed for elders, you may say, well, that's not a work of an elder, that's a work of a Christian. By the way, most of the things that elders are supposed to do are works of Christians, not solely elders. But holding firm to the faith is the first work of an elder. The other things can't happen unless he is doing that first work properly. And then in Titus, the 4th that I have is silencing those of the circumcision party. I'm actually treating that as different than rebuking. And I'm doing that partly because he leans heavily into it. And so to me, it's a disservice to lump it in with rebuking. But you might think of these as separate, as instruction is teaching the brethren, rebuking is publicly calling out their sin, their false teaching, and their issues, and silencing is a completely different thing. That through the effort and import of what they say and do, those men are silenced because they know they have no leg to stand on, and they leave. That's the silencing. They leave the group. They're not causing problems anymore. So we spent a lot of time on 2 and 3 last week. Instruction versus rebuking. Those are 2 separate things. We need to look for both skills in our elders. And I'm not saying that every elder has to do both equally well, right? Some men may be better at instructing, some may be better at rebuking, but they have to hold both skills at some level, in my opinion. What stands out to you in verses 10 and 11 about that silencing of the circumcision party? Anything stand out? Oh, yeah, it says they're upsetting whole families. They're causing big trouble, big problems. What else?
The motivation of why they're doing it is for shameful gain. It's not because they don't know what they're doing.
Yeah, so their motivation is shameful gain. And again, it's not certain that this shameful gain is financial. There are some places where it is clearly financial. I'm not certain from this spot that it is, if it's financial or not. Part of what stands out to me is the extremely, what I would say, strong language he uses to describe these false teachers. They're insubordinate, they're empty talkers, and they're deceivers. And then you compare the concept of silencing. What does Paul say in other places that he did when he went into a city? No. That's when he leaves. But when he goes into a city, how does he seek out believers to teach? He goes to the synagogue, and then we actually know if he goes to a pagan city like Corinth, he goes to their form of the synagogue, goes to the temple, and then what does he do? He reasons with them. Does he say that we should reason with these people? These insubordinate, empty talkers and deceivers. He does not say we should reason with them. I'm not saying that means that you shouldn't try to teach these people. But he says to silence them, not to reason with them. The type of man who can silence false teaching when we are past the point of reasoning with the false teacher, that's a special skill. That is difficult to do, especially in a way that doesn't fracture a group. Barry?
Because there's a bunch of families that are obviously being deceived by it.
Yeah. And if they're being deceived, that means there are members of the group who are agreeing with the false teacher at some level. And so if it's simply a throwing them out the front door and there's no care or consideration or instruction as a part of that for the group, that will fracture that group. So he's not just caring, again, for silencing the false teacher. He has to care for number 2 on that list I gave you, which is instructing the brethren. That's why I see instruction, rebuke, and silencing as 3 different things, because they take different levels of care and concern and potentially temperament at some point from that elder or group of elders. What did you say?
About a family unit in its context. One of the words that the notes say in here is they might have been talking about the people that were might have been declaring that you shouldn't own anything and that kind of thing, because that would have people abandon their family from their responsibility to care for them. And it kind of goes into that next section where it talks about a group of people, but I don't think it's actually saying that what they say about the Cretans is true. It's just there are people who lie, are evil beasts, and lazy gluttons, that if their teaching leads to those things, you're going to tear families up. I'm asking why he specifically says it's going to affect families.
I think you can interpret the families here in 2 ways, potentially. One is you can think of it as the Teshes and the Lindsays and the Haynes, and that this false teaching is upsetting even within that family group belief. In some ways in Scripture, that wouldn't make sense as a concern to call out in some ways, because, Christ said that he was going to cause that thing to happen. So you may discount that as an interpretation. You could also think about this as when he says whole families, he means congregations. So I think we know the things that they're teaching. So that part of your question, at the end of verse 10, he tells us it's the circumcision party. We know what the circumcision party taught, that you needed to be circumcised if you were a Gentile in order to be part of the family of God. And so as to the other impacts about lazy and gluttons and those things, I don't know that that's part of this. I think this...
As we see people leave congregations, they usually leave in family and stuff. And as churches fragment, the ascension comes with somebody leading an entire family. So I kind of look toward that.
I think the greater way to take this point, though, is that it's not that these Judaizing or circumcision party teachers are coming in and Michael, you're going to be the bad guy here, Michael falls away and the rest of us are fine. It's that large groups of people are being impacted and upset by this teaching. It's not that there's a false teacher who's coming in and leading a person astray. They're doing much greater harm than that. I'm sure Michael is really fine, though. He's going to come back. We did talk a little bit about the character traits. One we referenced last week from this passage is that they need to be stewardly. They didn't need to be God's steward, as Titus lays out, or Paul lays out in verse 7. We talked a little bit about above reproach, and that The elders are to be above reproach because in this work of rebuking and silencing, in that regard, they don't need to open up themselves to essentially someone saying, well, like, you're not that great a Christian either. Here's all these issues with you. And essentially in that way, their ability to influence is eroded because they are not blameless. And then on the flip side of that, part of the instructing that they have to do is enabled by their example, that they're not just teaching in an academic fashion, well, this is what the Bible says, that through their life, they are teaching as examples in people's lives. But there's some other character traits that I think play out here that we didn't talk about. And if you go back to Ephesians 4 and you think about that the special servants are specifically seeking to create people that are steadfast and not blown about, you see that here as to why that's so important. And so, again, if they're seeking to create Christians and build up Christians to be steadfast and to not be blown about, what are they going to need to emulate when these false teachers come in? It's really easy. It's not a hard question. First, they're going to have to emulate steadfastness, not being blown about. That if the elders can't emulate that when they are exposed to false teaching, well, they can't create that in others. You can't create in others some characteristic or quality that you aren't exemplifying. And so this reiterates that need for that steadfastness. And then we also mentioned that the shameful gain piece comes up again. It's really interesting to me that when you look at almost every passage that deals with elders, there is some comment about shameful gain. And if you go back and think about the passages that talk about how the shepherds of Israel failed them, what did it say? What does it say that they did? They enriched themselves. They actually consumed those who they were supposed to be protecting. The shepherd became the wolf, seeking shameful gain. All right. Before we go on to Titus, any more comments, discussion so far? All right, before we do that, I'd like you to take out your job description matrix for special servants and just check and see, have you been making comments or writing notes to yourself about elders? And so as you look at that, you're looking for work and purpose, character and qualification, potentially relationship to other special servants, or references that you could write down so you can look at those later. We're going to take a couple minutes, and I want you guys to have a moment to write some things down that we discussed or that we've discussed so far last week and this week, and then we'll go on to Titus 1. As a reminder, also, we're going to go on to Titus 1 in a moment. And if you didn't grab a sheet when you walked in, we'll be using that from the back. What'd you say? Did I say? Yes, 1 Peter 5. I'm sorry. I don't even think there is a Titus 5. Oh, my word. I'm sorry. Get the sheet in the back. We're going to do whatever that tells us to. Except there's actually a typo on that, too. All right. That was about 2 minutes, minute and a half. We're now going to look at 1 Peter 5. At the top it says 5, 1 through 11 on your sheet. We're actually going to do less than that. I kind of shortened it afterwards. So the first thing we'll do is we'll read. As usual, make some notes, circle some things to help enable our conversation in a little bit. So I exhort the elders among you, as a fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, as well as a partaker in the glory that is going to be revealed. Shepherd the flock of God that is among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion but willingly, as God would have you, not for shameful gain but eagerly, not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. Likewise, you who are younger, be subject to the elders. Clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another. For God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. All right, take a moment, jot some notes down about what you see as the work of the elder, qualifications, and there's some other questions there to prompt some thoughts. All right, what did you notice here in 1 Peter 5? Michael?
There's 3 not buts.
Yeah. There's 3, not this, but, and that's what I would describe as the how. So he spends a good bit of time on the how. What's the what? What's the work that they're supposed to do that he doesn't spend a lot of time on when he describes it?
Shepherding the flock.
Shepherding the flock, and there's a gerund after that you could say is a different instruction or description of how to do it.
Exercise oversight.
Yeah, exercise oversight. So I have that as 2, shepherding the flock and exercising oversight. If you said that actually exercising oversight is a description of shepherding, I agree with you, but if you only limit shepherding to exercising oversight, we're going to have an issue. We're going to have a struggle with one another and understanding this. So he tells them to shepherd. Part of that will be exercising oversight. And then he gives us these not buts. What's the first one? Oh, Donald, go ahead.
Well, to this point, this exercise and oversight, I've never realized that it's interesting that he uses that word exercise, and then he says not doing it under compulsion, which to me that means this is going to take some time. Like you're going to have a level of patience with these people to where you don't get to a point where you're coercing people to follow you and to listen to what you're saying. You're going to have to actually take your time with these people. Be patient with them, be kind, be gentle. So anyway,
So your point there is really interesting because you have interpreted that first not but differently than I have. So I interpret the first not but, not under compulsion but willingly, as a description of the elder service. But your point of view sounds like it's different. That you're describing that as he's leading the people, he's exercising oversight under them, they're not under compulsion, but that they are to follow willingly. Do I understand your point right, Donald? By the way, I'm not saying it's wrong. I actually really like it.
Yeah, correct. That's correct.
Okay.
I guess what I was getting at was you don't want to force them to follow you. You want to be an example, and part of that I think is not getting upset and not being so impulsive. It's just leading with kindness and gentleness. So it may not actually be.
It's different than what I thought, but I'm very interested in. It's different than what Barry thought too, and he's like, that's Crystal.
So I think that if you think about exercise in an exercising way, like sometimes we exercise because we have to, and sometimes we exercise because we are willing to, and which feels better. Like we want to exercise and therefore we get joy out of it. If we do it because we have to, then no joy.
Yeah, there's no joy. Yeah. What's the second not but? Yeah, not for shameful gain, but eagerly. And so this speaks to the part of the motivation of service of the elder, that if you have to compensate them and pay them, that may not be a great scenario. That if they're seeking this work because of compensation, here, and by the way, I would not say all compensation is shameful gain, by the way, but they're seeking this for shameful gain instead of they seek to do the work eagerly, which is interesting when you compare it to 1 Timothy 4, when we were talking about that the part of the evangelist's role was to help identify when elders were serving in such a way that they deserved that double honor. And so that would, again, when you put that with this, that would say those are men who are serving eagerly, and in that others recognize, man, you are working hard, you are dedicated. We should make certain that we are honoring you for that, as opposed to something that's a conversation that's like, well, if you guys don't pay me, I'm not doing this job. Right? Crystal?
I think that's part of what we have talked about having relationships before and investing in people before you are an elder. Because if you're doing that before, you're not looking for power. You're doing it without the power and you're not gaining anything.
Yeah. Micah?
Tagging onto that, just thinking about the why, right? The willingly, the eagerly, the example, those things being done beforehand, character traits and such like that. Those aren't things that you just say, oh, okay, I'll be eager about this. Oh, okay, I'll be willing about that. Like it goes deeper to the heart of the type of person and their true desire to serve and to build up the body. That has to be something that they have developed for a deeper, stronger reason than for the not guts, not the self, not the shameful gain. That has to be something that they have discovered for themselves through discipline and desire to serve.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that's the fruit of that looks different. Like when you look at the men that are doing that, their reasoning, their why has to be beyond themselves. You will see that.
Yeah, the concept of eagerness is not a switch that flips when you appoint someone as an elder. Eagerness is seen in how they are approaching their service prior to being an elder, and then how they approach being an elder once they're appointed, once they're given more responsibility. Are they approaching that eagerly, or like, oh man, this group is just a burden on me. This work is a burden on me. There is a weight to it, but that's different than a burden in terms of how you feel about that work. Brian?
Just to compound on that or add another layer, really the same, maybe a different way, whatever. But these first two are connected, I think always are.
Yeah.
In the sense of that if you're eagerly serving and not for shameful gain, you're going to be doing it and not under compulsion. And when we look at the two different scenarios this can play out is what is their goal and what is the result of their fulfillment of that. We have one man who could be in there to receive the glory of them, not necessarily
Right.
power. And so he's probably, once he's there, he's already receiving what he's desired, and he's not wanting to serve. He's not having the eagerness to do the work of an overseer or an elder because he's already receiving his reward. But on the flip side of that, we see someone who is wanting to serve and see the growth of others. They're going to be willing to do that, not under different circumstances, because their fruit, their reward is seeing the growth in others, not the fulfillment of what they're getting out of it. And I think that's, obviously all that connecting plays a part in their mentality behind what they're doing and the result.
Yeah, and I think all of that harkens back to that Ephesians 4 intro to our class of if they're seeking how to equip the saints, how to stabilize the saints, how to get the group to work properly and show love, all of that looks much different than if he's doing these things he's not supposed to do. Chip?
To me, it speaks to a principle about trying to understand someone's motives, and then how effective would they be in helping someone else. If the motives of James and John were to be at the right and the left hand of Christ, then anybody that they were advising, teaching, helping, some might say, well, they're only doing this because they're the right left hand of Christ, that they have to.
Yeah.
It's similar to an elder or anyone, frankly, any church member. If you're being paid to do something, someone might say, well, he's only doing this because he's getting paid to do it. Or he's under some obligation. He's obligated to come and see me if I'm in the hospital, not because he loves me or cares about me, or she. So I think it speaks to how effective you would be in the duties that you have based on the way you come into the role.
Yeah. An example I would use for that, I hope I don't embarrass him, would be Barry. When Barry left Brentwood, he wasn't being paid to be an evangelist anymore. He still did the work of an evangelist. And then as a group, we decided to take part in that work and to support him in that. That's an example of how someone can do the work regardless of position, place, compensation, and then others can say, we should honor this. And the way that the 1 Timothy talks about double honor, we should honor this and enable that service. And by the way, I think that's why Woodland Hills has had one of the most, what I would say, scriptural relationships with an evangelist that I've ever seen. It's because that's how we approached it. We did not approach it as a hireling. The elders approached it way back when as, can we support you in your work? And by the way, that means you can hopefully take our pulpit some and teach some here too. That's vastly different from, we're going to pay you, will you do this job? And if we don't, you say, I'm not going to do the job. It's very different. The third not but here is not domineering, but being examples to the flock. Domineering indicates power. I compel you to do this. I force you to do this. I make decisions and you respond. This concept of leadership by example requires a different man than one that can make decisions. Making decisions may be part of that work, but the reason that people are willing to follow those decisions is not because of a power dominance relationship. It's as a shepherd leading people to a place of calm, of feeding, of cool waters, and of rest. That's why the flock follows the shepherd. He doesn't beat every one of the sheep into submission to force them to follow him. They follow the shepherd from a place of willing desire. They want to follow the shepherd. And the shepherd that's shown here is one that leads that flock not with an iron fist or a staff of pain, but instead one that seeks what's good for the flock. And as a result, the flock follows him. Next week, we're going to talk some about deacons. We'll start here, though, because we did not talk about verse 5 of Titus, or 1 Peter 5, and I really want us to spend some time there. If you have some time this week, feel free to look at that, because I think the conversation of how the younger, I would say the not elders, respond to the elders is extremely important for peace and unity in the group. Thank you all so much for your comments this morning.